If you could all take your seats. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jerry McDermott. I'm the chair of the International Business Department, and it is my proud honor to introduce you to the big man himself, our Dean, Rohit Verma.
Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jerry mentioned, my name is Rohit Verma, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Dean of the Darla Moore School of Business at University of South Carolina. It's wonderful to welcome all of you for this exciting event today. A little bit about myself. I grew up in India, and then I got a chance to live in New York, Utah, Chicago, Vietnam, and I've been fortunate to travel many countries around the world. So I thought that I have experienced just about every type of cuisine you can imagine. And then I moved to South Carolina. And there are some few important lessons for those of you who are here for first time in South Carolina. First, everything can be fried. And second, if it's not fried, it probably comes with a gravy. Those are two things I have learned recently. But between shrimp and grits, fried green tomatoes, the mysterious powers of pimento cheese, and soothing iced tea, I've come to realize that this isn't about just food. It's the Southern hospitality of its best kind. And so my wife Amita and I are so honored to call South Carolina our home. Thank you very much for welcoming us here. Now, speaking of collaboration and good taste, today's event comes together thanks to many wonderful partners. I would like to begin by thanking the Folk Center for International Business at the Darla Moore School of Business and the Walker Institute of International and Area Studies at the McFaul College of Arts and Science, both here at the University of South Carolina, for their generous support and for organizing today's program. I also want to recognize the faculty of the Department of Anthropology and Sonoco Department of International Business for their support, and special gratitude to the Jim and Rachel Hodges Fund for their financial support. Thank you so much for making this possible. We are also deeply thankful to Columbia World Affairs Council. I saw Dixon Monk someplace, thank you, for helping us promote this event along with its member and to the greater Columbia area. And also, I would like to acknowledge several special guests who are seated in the VIP section in the front of the auditorium. They include former US Ambassador to Slovenia, Jamie Harputnin, Senator Gerald Malloy, Mayor Daniel Rickerman, our Provost Marianne Fitzpatrick, our VP for Research, Julius Fredrickson, and our Deans of McFaul School, College of Arts and Sciences, Tommy Hodges. Thank you very much for making the time to be here. And finally, several members of our external advisory board, such as Darla Moore School of Business's Business Partnership Foundation, Dean's Advisory Council, and other advisory council members are here in the room. Thank you also for coming and for support to our university and community. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Carl Dahlman, Director of the Walker Institute of International and Area Studies, to introduce our distinguished guest, Ambassador Michael McFaul. Carl?
Thank you, Dean Verma. Good evening, and thank you for being here. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I'd like to share my appreciation to Dean Verma and Jerry McDermott, who agreed to co-organize this event with the Walker Institute. The Walker Institute of International and Area Studies has been bringing the world to Carolina since 1961, and we're very happy to share this event with all of you this evening. I also want to thank our excellent staff, especially Amy Thompson, Luann Aycock, and Natasha Thomas, who make amazing evenings like this happen. Let me also highlight my colleagues, Dr. Kara Brown from the Walker Institute's program on Slavic, East Central European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as Drs. Magda Stokowski and Stan Marcus, who will lead the fireside chat following our guests' remarks. Ambassador Michael McFaul is the Olivier Nomalini Professor in International Studies at Stanford University, where he is also Senior Fellow and Director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. From 2012 to 14, Dr. McFaul was the U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation and before that, he served as Special Assistant to the U.S. President and Senior Director of Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council. Born and raised in Montana, McFaul attended Stanford University, where he earned a BA in International Relations and Slavic Studies, and then an MA in Russian and East European Studies. McFaul was named a Rhodes Scholar and completed his PhD in International Relations at Oxford University. He is fluent in Russian and also speaks Polish and Portuguese. He has performed wide-ranging public service and has been recognized with awards and honors too numerous to mention, but I will pick one. He was awarded in 2022 the Order of Merit by President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ambassador McFaul has written numerous academic works, opinion pieces, essays, and analyses. He will be speaking this evening on his 10th book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Order. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ambassador Michael McFaul.
Thanks for having me. Do I see a clicker or should I just stand here? Where should I? There we go. All right, I'll just stand here. I am really thrilled to be here at the best USC in the United States of America. So for those of you who don't know, we used to be in something called the Pac-12 at Stanford, and then another USC, I don't know exactly where it is, somewhere in Southern California or something, they decided to abandon us, and now we're in the ACC because that other USC abandoned us. So I'm really glad to be at the real USC, the best USC, but I also love the Trojans if never I'm in Southern California. But I do want to talk about my new book today. Thanks for having me. The official launch, just so you know, is next week. It's published in October 28th. And it will be, I think I'm in a town called Cambridge, Massachusetts, speaking about it there with Rachel Maddow, by the way, is going to moderate that event. But somehow you at USC figured out a way to get the book ahead of time and get me here. And so this is like the last game of the preseason, but this is a fantastic turnout for the last game of the preseason. Thank you all for coming. So I want to start with some history. I just celebrated a reunion at Stanford when I went there as a 17-year-old kid. I was there in the late 80s and early 90s doing academic work at Oxford as well. And for those, I can see some of you are old enough to remember this, but I'm also glad to see a lot of you are too young to remember this. That's great that you're here. I really love to see all the students here. So I want to remind those that are old enough and underscore those that don't remember this history, just how wonderful and great it was 30 years ago to be an American and to believe in democracy. I was living in the Soviet Union actually in 1990-91. And after the Berlin Wall came down and after the Soviet Union collapsed, we, the United States, and I realize not everybody here is from the United States, but we were the only superpower in the world. That was good. Democracy seemed to be embraced by the entire world. Where I was living in Russia, they all wanted to be part of the democratic world. That's when my colleague Frank Fukuyama wrote this essay about the end of history, because it seemed like everybody wanted to be part of the democratic world. Capitalism also was the only game in town. And even this thing we called the liberal international order seemed to be working. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, all the great powers, all the countries of the world got together and said, we're not going to let that happen. It seemed like the United Nations was even working back then. And I just told you I was living in Moscow. If you look really hard, you can see me. I'm there. All of these people, these are Russians, but Ukrainians, Georgians, Estonians, they were all out protesting. The Soviet Union still existed, to join the West, to become a capitalist country, to become a democracy. It was an exciting time to be in Russia, and I would say an exciting time to be a small d Democrat. Fast forward to now, to your time, for you students here, it's not so fun. It's not so great. First, it started with the Russians, where we talked about a new Cold War. And you can see some of these quotes from Russians and Americans. And then it became a hot war in 2022, first major conventional war in Europe since 1945, first annexation, major annexation in Europe since World War II, the biggest threat, in my view, to great power war, and that threat is still upon us in generations. And even in the fall of 2022, Putin was threatening to use nuclear weapons. That's the first time that happened since 1962, and in some ways I think the threat was even bigger in 2022 than 62. Likewise, it took a little longer, but the debate on China has also been framed as a new Cold War. You can read the quotes there, you can see the headlines, and we are most certainly in a confrontational period between the United States and China compared to where we were 30 years ago. So the question I want to first start with is what happened? What happened between these two photos? That's Gorbachev and Reagan on the right, on the left, and that's Obama and Putin on the right. That's in Los Cabos, Mexico, by the way. I was in the government at the time, and let me tell you, the meeting was a lot worse than that picture. It was a very antagonistic meeting. Same things happened with the Chinese. So the first thing I want to do tonight, as a professor, is I want to explain how we got there. That's going to be, most of my remarks is going to be on the first piece of the roadmap here. And then, if we are in a Cold War, I want to learn some of the lessons from the Cold War so that we maybe do better this time around as the United States. Oops, oh, I skipped number 2. Similarities and differences. You're going to see that I actually believe it's somewhat like the Cold War and somewhat not. And that's why my book is over 500 pages long. I apologize for that. You should know the first draft was 1,200 pages. But I think it's a complex world. And if we just cartoonize everything in black and white ways, I think we're going to not understand the world. Third, lessons from the Cold War. And 4, if I have time, I'm going to end with some reasons for hope. All right, first on the causes. I think there are 3 main drivers to the causes: power, regimes, and leaders. Everything starts with power. I think I just skipped one there. Oh, there it is. I got that mixed up. Everything starts with power, right? So the United States and China today are the 2 most powerful countries in the world. In the book, I go through all kinds of metrics. Russia, in terms of economic power, they're 11th. Military power, that they're at the top. And I want to just emphasize that because China became more powerful and Russia became more powerful today and compared to 30 years ago, that's a part of the conflict. That's a part of tensions. My guess, anybody from Moldova here? No, good. I love Moldova, just so you know, I've been there, it's a great country, but you're not interested in a lecture about US-Moldovan relations because Moldova doesn't have the power to influence our security or our prosperity. There's a reason we've focused on China and Russia. It's partly because of power. But it's only partly because of power. Because Germany also is a lot more powerful today compared to 45. I'm not losing any sleep about war with Germany. Same with Japan. Poland, way more powerful today than they were 30 years ago. I'm not losing any sleep about war between Poland and the United States. And that's because I think, and I try to spell this out with data in the book, that regimes matter too. That autocrats behave differently in the world than democrats. Democracies tend to not go to war with each other, whereas autocracies and democracies tend to have more confrontational relationships. And over the last 30 years, China has become more autocratic, Russia has gone from a democracy to dictatorship, and relatively speaking, the United States is less democratic, and the world is less democratic, and that, I think, is a second source of this confrontation. So Xi and Putin, I think, we can go through that later in questions, but China has always been autocratic, but has become more autocratic, especially with the crackdowns within the PRC and now with respect to Hong Kong. And Putin, without question, compared to where Russia was in the 1990s, much more autocratic country. That's Alexei Navalny, who he killed just last year. Much more autocratic places. The United States, tragically, in my view, has also become less democratic. That has emboldened the autocrats around the world. Note, this starts before Trump. We had a bit of an uptick last year. My guess is that it'll be flat or going down. And likewise, around the world, if you look at the entire world, we had a little bit of an uptick last year, but over the last 2 decades, there's been gradual democratic decline. And you put those two things together, I think that leads to more confrontation between autocratic China, autocratic Russia, and democratic United States and our allies. And yet, and I want to emphasize that, and yet, right, it's complicated. Even when the autocracies are growing and the democracies are waning, I want to underscore that Xi Jinping and Putin are still threatened by the ideas of democracy and democratic breakthrough, even in this era of democratic decline. In Russia, it started with these revolutions: Serbia 2000, Georgia 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, where democratic expansion, not NATO expansion, democratic expansion became a threat to autocratic Russia under Vladimir Putin. And in fact, I haven't had the chance to listen to him talk about this. This is in the summer of 2009, President Obama's first trip to Russia. Putin is prime minister. He's hosting us for breakfast there. And we talked about these things. And Putin gave a long lecture. He knows how to go on and on and on, by the way. This one, I think he went on for 56 minutes before President Obama said a word. By the way, I was super nervous because my job after this meeting was I was supposed to brief the press as a senior administration official, when you've ever seen that in the press. And the meeting was scheduled for 60 minutes. And at minute 57, my guy hadn't sent a single word. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to tell the president? That he just listened and said nothing? Luckily, the meeting went for 4 hours. I had a lot to say, but I was sweating at about this time. But in this meeting, you know, Putin went on about all of our mistakes, and he talked about the Iraq War, and he talked about us fomenting regime change abroad. And President Obama said, well, I don't know if you knew this, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, but I was against the war in Iraq. I'm against that. And Putin had never heard an American say that. He'd always been talking to President Bush and his colleagues. And then he said, we're not going to do regime change. We're not going to do that. We're going to have a different policy towards the rest of the world. And I think Putin maybe thought things might be different. But then, just a year and a half later, there was something called the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And I want to underscore, I worked at the White House during these events, first in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Syria, then Libya, Bahrain. We had nothing to do with fomenting this massive mobilization against these autocratic regimes. This is our ally, folks. Mubarak was our ally at the time. This was Egyptians and Tunisians and Libyans and Syrians acting on their own behalf, but not for Putin. Putin thought it's all the CIA-conspired thing. It's the deep state here in the United States. And then it happened in his country, same year. Parliamentary election, falsified like normal Russian elections, 5-6%. We sat around with that. This is no big deal. This is just the way it is in Russia. But these folks, they had a different view. We would call them the middle class. They used a phrase called the creative class. These are people that own things. And they had a slogan. I don't know if you've heard of it. No taxation without representation. And that's because they didn't want to give their money to the government without having their elected officials elected in free and fair elections. And this went from 5 to 500 to 200,000 people on the streets of Moscow. And again, Putin blamed us. He blamed Barack Obama, he blamed Secretary Clinton, and he blamed me personally. That's when I showed up to become the U.S. ambassador. As we teach at Stanford, correlation is not causation, right? I just happened to become the U.S. ambassador right when all that mobilization was going on, but you can see from this quote from Russian media, they blamed me for fomenting revolution, for supporting the leader of this movement, Alexei Navalny. I kind of became the poster child for this attack against our country, the United States. And when I say poster child, I mean literally poster child. This was circulated in 2012, and it was a calendar of all the McFaul girls were the opposition folks. And then Ukraine. Just 2 years later, do you see a pattern? Massive mobilization. All of these people are protesting. You know what they want? They want to join the European Union. That's why they're mobilized. And eventually, there was violence. Eventually, President Yanukovych fled, and these folks led what they call, in Ukraine, the revolution of dignity. Putin calls it a CIA-inspired, a CIA-orchestrated revolution against his guy, and that's why autocrats versus Democrats clash. And then, after his first invasion in 2014, in response to those large crowds that I just showed you, he decided he had to go in and crush the democratic government of Ukraine and crush the independent country of Ukraine. I've sat in the room with Putin, and he says two things that are contradictory. On the one hand, if you're in the room with him, he'll tell you that Ukrainians are not a separate nation. They're just Russians with accents. He literally says that. And it was the Bolsheviks in 1917, and then the Americans in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that pulled apart the Slavic nation. But he wants to bring it back together because they were destined to be together. So that's the first thing he says. But the other thing he says is that, and in fact, he said this in a meeting I was in with him with the Vice President Biden in 2011. And we're talking, we're arguing. I'm going to make this a little more dramatic. You're going to get to be Vice President Biden. Do you mind? You mind? Okay. Do you mind? Or you don't mind? Okay. All right. All right. Putin doesn't blink, by the way, when you're in a meeting with him. And I blink. But we were arguing about Georgia or something, and he leans in and he points at the vice president. He said, you know what your problem is? You look at us, and you think that we think like you because of the color of our skin. He went just like this, the color of our skin. But we don't. Мы другая, for those who speak Russian, right? And I was like, whoa, what is going on here? But what he was trying to say was, we're not part of your liberal, decadent West. We're not part of your democratic world. Russian culture, Russian history, we're separate from that. Now, I think he's wrong about that. I don't think that's true, but that's his worldview. But if Ukrainians, remember, Ukrainians are just Russian with accents, are practicing democracy, are practicing a free society, are practicing market capitalism, that's a contradiction to his argument for his legitimacy back home. And that's why he's so threatened by the Ukrainians. That's why he invaded in 2022. I went on long about Russia, but I would say the same thing about Xi Jinping. These are all revolutionary movements for democracy that threaten his regime. It got especially acute in Hong Kong in 2014. All these people want is what we have in our country, a freedom, rule of law, an ability to vote their own legislatures. That's a threat to Xi Jinping. These folks in Taiwan are too. That's from 2022 when I was there with a delegation from Stanford. Undermines his argument as well. These are all Chinese people that are also practicing democracy. And so I think regime conflict is a second element of it. But there's a third one that I also think is important, and that's individual leaders. Power, regimes, and then leaders. I think had there been a different leader coming to power in China, instead of Xi Jinping, there could have been a different course in terms of this confrontation. Likewise with Putin, and likewise with Trump and Biden. Let me explain that briefly. So Putin, I think, is pretty self-evident. Like he's invading Georgia, then Ukraine, then Syria, Ukraine 2022. Another leader at the time might have not done all these things. And the reason I believe that is because I know some of these other leaders. If Boris Nemtsov had become president, for instance, in the year 2000 in Russia, I don't think he would have done all these things. I knew that him personally. He was one of the candidates, and had he been president, it would have been different. Likewise with Xi Jinping, I think these aggressive actions that we've seen in the last decade or so are something unique to him and not necessarily something you get with Chinese power or the Chinese Communist Party, because it wasn't always that way. And likewise, here in my country, in our country, when President Trump won the first time around, his national security team wrote this very famous new national security strategy, where they identified China and Russia as revisionist powers. That was different than the Obama administration. By the way, I agree with this analysis. I think this is right. I think it was right to make this pivot. I'm not so sure the president himself agrees with his own national security strategy. I'll come back to that when we get to the end of my talk. But this was a pivot because of an election in our country. And then after it, the Biden administration continued along the Trump pivot, especially towards China and eventually towards Russia when they invaded Ukraine. I think leaders matter as well. All right. Okay, good. We got some time. So if that explains how we got to this era of great power competition, some would call it Cold War 2.0, what can we learn? What are the similarities and differences with the Cold War? And I'm not going to go through, these are complex slides. I'm going to go through them fast so we can get to your questions. But the main takeaway here is that there are similarities and differences. And we have to appreciate both and not just believe that we are repeating the Cold War. Because if we just superimpose the Cold War framework on our competition with China and Russia, I think we're going to get some things wrong. So similarities with respect to Russia, there are some similarities here, right? We're the only two nuclear powers in the world. China's catching up. They're not there yet. We are both two major conventional military powers, although the United States, in my view and my assessment in the book, much stronger than Russia. There's an economic asymmetry between the United States and Russia, just as there was during the Cold War. And there is an ideological competition between autocrats and Democrats, just like there was during the Cold War. Those are the similarities. But I think there's some key differences as well. And let me just focus on two in the interest of time. The third one is different. Even during the Cold War, with some minor exceptions. But we fought World War II because we wanted to end annexation. We thought that that was bad, that was disruptive. When I teach at Stanford a course on American foreign policy, I started with a movie of 6 minutes of European history, in 1,000 years of European history in 6 minutes. Okay, and what do you see? You see countries getting bigger, smaller, the borders changing all the time, the Mongols come, the Nazis come, Napoleon comes, the Soviets come, lots of annexation and lots of killing. And then in 45, it stops. It freezes. We're now in a new era with the Russians where annexation is back, and I think that's somewhat dangerous, more dangerous compared to the Cold War. But the second one I want to also foot stomp on for 2 seconds. This is not a fight between capitalism and communism or communism and the free world. You know, remember, for those of you who are old as me, there was the red team and the blue team, and which country, Angola, is that red or blue? Oh, they just flipped to the red team. Where's Germany? Germany, well, half of it's blue, a little piece of it's red, right? The Cold War struggle was between states. Right? At least most of it was. There were some communists here and there in the West. We had some communists up in UC Berkeley, by the way. I used to see them. I was studying national liberation movement, so I'd go get their materials and stuff. Maybe you had some communists here, I don't know, but they were pretty marginalist folks. What's different about the conflict with Russia today is that the fight is not just between autocratic and democratic countries. The fight is within countries as well. And Putin has a brand of what I call illiberal nationalism, that as I said before, the West is decadent and their ideas are bad, and we are going to be the bastion of what he calls, not my words, his words, conservative, orthodox Christian values. And for the first decade he was in power, he consolidated the regime around those ideas. But for the last 20 years, and especially in the last 10 years, he's been propagating those ideas through things like Russia Today, through NGOs, through the Russian Orthodox Church, where they're finding like-minded individuals and organizations and political parties inside Hungary, inside Italy, inside France, and inside the United States of America. That's new. That's new. That's different from the Cold War. Likewise with China, two superpowers, yes. Different regime types, yes, just like the Cold War. Ideological composition around the world, yes. And tragically, the prediction in the book is that this is going to last for a long, long time, just like the Cold War lasted for decades. But there are also really important differences. And here, the differences, I think, are really important to understand. And I won't go through, again, another very complicated slide. I'll come back to it during questions. But let me just talk about the two that I think are most important. One, there is an ideological competition, and the Chinese do support autocracies and autocrats around the world. But are they proactively fomenting revolution in the United States or the developed world? I don't see the evidence for that. Are they exporting communism? I don't see the evidence for that. So it's an ideological struggle, but I do not think it is as acute as the fight was with the Soviets. And therefore, our policy has to be driven by that difference. But another one on the differences is about us. And I'll say more about this at the end of my talk. We are in a period of retrenchment right now. We are in a period where a lot of Americans say, you know, what happens abroad, that's not our problem. Ukraine, where is that? Taiwan, why should I care about Taiwan? Competing with the Chinese in Africa, we got our problems here at home. My mom in Montana says that all the time to me. Mike, should I care about Ukraine so much? I don't want to spend money here in Montana. And that is something new. That's something we didn't have. And that worries me a lot, as you're going to see when I get to the end of my talk. And this other giant difference. These folks were split. Soviet Union and China was split for most of the Cold War. They are allies today. All right, so if there's some things that are similar, can we learn some lessons? I think there are three big lessons. Don't repeat our failures from the Cold War. Emulate the successes. And then some things are just new and require new policies that have nothing to do with the Cold War. Let me run through some of these lessons. So, when I was ambassador to Moscow, I coached third grade basketball. I coached my son's basketball team. I don't think any ambassador before or after me has ever been the coach of a third grade basketball team in Moscow. And what I learned, coaching basketball, and I watch a lot of basketball. I hope you saw the Warriors won last night. I'm the only one that stayed up for that, I can tell, or cares. What I learned in basketball, if you win, everybody forgets about all the mistakes you made, right? So my son was the star of the basketball team because he's American. He came over to Russia where they play hockey, not basketball. So we moved there during the middle of the season. The team he joined was 0 for 8. He joined, and we won the championship, right? Because Luke was our star. And the play was pass the ball to Luke and get out of the way. And all the Russians loved to do that, and they loved Luke because he actually could score. They couldn't get the ball up that high. But if Luke fouled out in the second quarter, or had 3 fouls, we had to bench him, and we won, everybody forgot about that. But when he had 3 fouls in the second quarter and we lost, and by the way, he often had 3 fouls in the second quarter, then everybody remembers that. A problem in the debate we're having about how to compete with China and Russia today is we're forgetting some of these mistakes. And the big ones are threat misperceptions, just exaggerating the threat, overreach. We're not going to be able to contain the Chinese and Russians everywhere, but we're trying to. And then embracing good dictators. We embraced these horrific regimes during the Cold War, like apartheid South Africa, Pinochet in Chile. We didn't have to do that to win the Cold War. I hope we don't repeat these mistakes again. But we also did some smart things during the Cold War that I'm worried we're not learning these lessons, right? Allies, man, that's our super strength that we learned from the Cold War. We had better allies than the Soviets, and it helped us win the Cold War. 2, American prosperity. At the end of the day, we were richer than the Soviets. West Germany was richer than East Germany. South Korea was richer than North Korea, and that helped us win the Cold War. Literally, in 1989, when East Germans and Hungarians earlier started to walk to the other side, is because they saw that we were richer. That is a key thing we have to do again today. 3, promoting democracy. Sometimes we didn't do it, right? I just showed you apartheid South Africa, we were allies with that regime. But other times, through things like USAID, Radio Free Europe, the National Endowment for Democracy, we helped small d Democrats around the world, and I think that helped us to prevail in the Cold War. And then forced soft power, we talked about that today in the talk earlier. Huge, big advantage we had during the Cold War. And today I see a mixed record. I see we're doing some things right. Our economy is still one of the strongest in the developed world. We need to continue to do that, although I worry about some of these other things are going to hurt us in the long term. I worry a lot about it. Second, military spending. It's tragic but necessary that we have the big military budget that we do. We have to spend that money just like we did during the Cold War for our security. But here's the things we're not doing today. That worries me a lot. Weakening our allies. There's no reason to do that. Pissing them off with tariffs and threatening to invade their countries. Eroding global capitalism. Yes, we had a lot of flaws with the WTO, and there are a lot of flaws in some of our trade agreements, but the solution to that is not to destroy them, but to reform them, at least in my view. And third, this soft power retreat, which probably worries me most of all. President Trump decided to close down USAID. USAID was created in 1961 by John F. Kennedy at the height of the Cold War so that we could compete with the Soviets around the developing world. We're not going to be able to compete with the Chinese folks if we don't have that instrument in our arsenal. Because let me tell you, they're not shutting down their economic assistance programs. They're not unilaterally disarming. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, also controversial, needs reform, I got it. But shutting them down, that I think is a huge mistake. Because again, the Chinese and the Russians aren't shutting down their international media. Reducing diplomats, I don't understand why we're cutting our diplomatic corps at a time when the Chinese are expanding. And then, of course, you can't be in the struggle between autocrats and Democrats if you're not performing as a democracy at home, and we are in a period where that is challenging today. And then these are longer term things. Actually, in the interest of time, I won't go through it. But these are longer things that I see hints of, McCarthyism in particular, overreach, embracing dictators. These are things we did in the Cold War we don't need to do again. And then finally, on this one, there are new challenges. Isolationism and polarization. I already hinted at isolationism. This is a long tradition in America, goes back to the 18th century. My book, by the way, starts in the 18th century. I trace the history all the way back, US-China, US-Russia relations from the founding of our republic. And this is happening, and Trump was aggressive with it. But I want to remind you, this is not a Republican issue. This is a bipartisan issue. Lots of Americans in the Democratic Party and independents think that we should pull back as well. That's new. We didn't have that challenge during the Cold War. And when we talk about democracy promotion, look at how many Americans support it, just 18%. That's new. Didn't have that during the Cold War. That is a new challenge. And then polarization. I don't know if you can see that. Half are standing, half are sitting. That's kind of confusing. You can't see it. But polarization, this is also acute. Now, we had polarization in our country in the 60s and early 70s, pretty desperate times. But I think this is bigger. And the fact that the center is disappearing. Note I'm quoting a Republican here, just so we're clear about that. My colleague Condi Rice. This makes it hard. Because during the Cold War, yeah, there were Democrats and Republicans. We fought about the contours of where the borders of containment were. But we had a kind of bipartisan consensus between the 45-yard lines. That is eroding in America today, and I think that'll make it harder for us to compete with China and Russia over the decades. And the biggest threat, as I've already intimated, is our polarization here at home. If we're united, I'm extremely confident we're going to be fine with both the Chinese and the Russians. I'm going to show you that data in a moment. What I worry most about is our polarization at home becomes so acute that we can't fight our real enemies or our real competitors abroad. But I told you reasons for hope. I'm going to do this quickly in 5 minutes. I am hopeful about the long term. I'd much rather be on the blue team than the red team when you think about aggregate power and you think about long-term trajectories. And let me just go through some of these right now. So military power, we're still one of 2 global superpowers in the world, and we will be for a long, long time. That's good news. That helps us deter our adversaries. Second, allies. We're messing around with this. I'm nervous about that, but we still have them together, and we are doing some positive things in burden sharing. I actually support the president on that. And look at Team Blue versus Team Red. We are stronger when it comes to our allies. And when you add up all our conventional power together, the numbers are overwhelmingly in favor of us compared to the Chinese and the Russians. That's good news. Second, economic power. The Chinese are closing the gap. You can see it here, right? They are definitely closing the gap. And that worries me a lot. I write about that in detail in the book. The Russians lagging behind. Putin, by invading Ukraine, they got them distracted. They're lagging behind. But the Chinese are catching up. And yet, when we add it up, democracies versus dictatorships, democracies, Democrats versus autocrats, I still see overwhelming advantages to the free world. 9 of the 10 largest economies in the world are democracies. GDP per capita, this race is not even close. China, and I'll take this bet from anybody after I get done talking, I will wager $10,000 that China will not catch up to the United States GDP per capita in this century. Now, I probably won't last long enough to be good on that bet, but I just don't see it happening. And by the way, when you add all the democracies in this, the richest countries in the world, GDP per capita, the top 20, with the exception of Singapore, are all democracies. China, Russia, lagging way behind. Universities, including the university we're at right now, we have the best universities in the world. These are just the top 50. This has been a superpower strength that we attract the best and the brightest from all over the world. I've met some of those international students here since I've been here. A giant, fantastic advantage as long as we continue to nurture it with new money for research and development and visas for our international students. Most valuable companies in the world, we're at the top. China breaks the top 20, but we're still way ahead here as well. And then on the economic development part, and I have a whole chapter in the book on this slide, I'm not so sure China is going to continue to grow the way they are because they grew in the past not because they were communist. I think that's a huge mistake that a lot of analysts are making. They grew in the past because they rolled back state control of their economy over the last 40 years, beginning with Deng Xiaoping. And now Xi Jinping is bringing the state back into the economy, and I think that is going to slow economic development in that country and add to that these structural problems, middle income to high income, very hard to make that transition. Inequality is rising in China. That is bad for economic growth. By the way, that's bad for economic growth here in the United States as well. And then their demographic challenges are enormous. I'm not so sure they're going to be able to grow at the rate they're growing today. And then last things I want to end on, ideational power. I think this other conservative, by the way, is right. Churchill was right. Democracy, horrible system of government, except for all those others tried. And guess what? Most people in the world agree with Churchill. That representative democracy is better than these other forms of rule. Most people around the world still agree. They criticize their democracy, but when you say, would you rather have a theocracy, or would you rather be ruled by a colonel, or would you rather to be ruled by Putin's son, they say, no, we prefer that we would choose our own leaders. That is not an American-only value. That is not a European value. That is a universal value. And the data, I think, is pretty overwhelming to support it. And then on this piece, I just want to say, well, maybe you don't care about democracy and autocracy, you just care about security. I would just to remind the Americans in the room that more democracy in the world makes us more secure. All of our enemies have been dictatorships. The War of 1812 is a little complicated, I know, and there's a few other complicated cases, but by and large, they have been in the past. When autocracies democratize, they become our allies. Germany, Japan, Italy, being the most prominent. And rising autocracies, as I've already shown, threaten our security. So I actually think to promote democracies is in our security interest, not just in our moral interests. And so let me end on this. I'm a political scientist. I've been a political scientist for most of my life, 3 decades. Just celebrated my 30th year at Stanford. And to the other political scientists in the room, I think we all need to admit we are really bad at predicting the future. And I'm sure we're going to get a question about that. I just want to say humbly, we're not very good at it. By the way, I worked 5 years in the government. The CIA is really bad at it too. We missed the Green Revolution in Iran, the Arab Spring in 2011, Bolotnaya in 2011, and the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And I don't blame them. It's just hard to predict mass mobilization in the future, right? So I want to be humble here, but I want to suggest that we faced these challenges in the past. 1930s was the worst of it, right? The world got really autocratic. And that wasn't the trajectory of history forever. 1970s, not that long ago, seemed like the whole world was becoming communist. Southeast Asia, Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, that seemed like the correlation of forces, to use a word that the Soviets used, was on their side, and we were in decline, both at home and around the world. 15 years later, 20 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so that's the world when it was really bad. So, and then you put it in this longer term perspective, there's the arc of history is definitely pointing towards democracy, not autocracy. So I think it's really too early to bet against America yet. But I also think it's too early to bet against small d Democrats as well. You really want to bet against this guy? President Zelensky? Think about the courage that he's had. You know, he didn't run when his country was attacked. He said, you know, we need ammunition, not a ride. Here's when he was younger. Look how young he looks there, by the way. That's at Stanford in 2021. But I want to be on his side. I don't want to be on the side of the autocrats. I would rather be on his side. I want to be on her side, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's leading the struggle for democracy in Belarus in exile. I've met her. I've met her many times, and she is an inspirational character. I want to be on these people that are fighting for these ideas. And at Stanford, I run a program over the summer where these are all small d Democrats from all over the world, and there is nothing more inspirational than spending time with people that are fighting for what we Americans take for granted. I think it's way too premature to bet against democracy just yet. Thanks for listening. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to now pivot to our discussion section, and let me introduce 2 of our colleagues who will lead this. First, Magdalena Swakowski is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the McFaul College of Arts and Sciences and a Faculty Associate at the Walker Institute. And my direct colleague, Stan Marcus here, is Associate Professor of International Business, a Business Partnership Foundation Fellow at the Darla Moore School of Business, and also co-faculty director of our Folk Center for International Business. So please make your way over there, and I will give you the microphone, and on we go.
Do we share one mic?
We will also, oh wait, hold on. I will,
Yeah.
okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, so glad to have you here. Please keep in mind that if you do have questions, you'll have an opportunity to ask them. There are 2 ways to ask a question. First way is you scan this QR code and you type it in on your device. And the second way, we will have people with paper cards. Just flag them, raise your hand, they will come to you, and you can give them, you can write on, there we go. They're waving. Okay, thank you.
Testing.
So I'm completely exhausted. So you guys should just ask each other questions,
I'm
okay?
pretty sure you're exhausted. It's been a long day and an amazing showing by amazing USC. So Ambassador McFaul,
Can I say one other thing about the audience?
Yes.
I talk at a lot of university campuses. I am so delighted to see so many students here. That's not oftentimes the case, so thank you for the students that
Bravo. So welcome to the Better USC. And I want to begin with something you started your talk with, which is you were in Moscow in 1991 during the coup attempt against Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. You described this period as exhilarating, a moment when Russia was moving closer to the democratic world. Then in 2009, you spearheaded Obama's Russia reset, believing we could work with Dmitry Medvedev. Now Putin is invading neighbors. Xi Jinping is building a surveillance state. Looking back, were you and perhaps were we naive about the arc of history?
That's a great question, and it's a hard question, and I struggle with it in the book. By the way, the epitaph in the book is Martin Luther King. The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But what I would add is people have to bend it that way. It doesn't happen naturally, organically, because of history. I would say a couple of things. So I was living in Moscow. I'd lived in Russia and the Soviet Union back then many times. So I was there in 1990, 1991, Fulbright scholar at Moscow State University. And I was finishing my dissertation, which was really about revolutions in Southern Africa and external influences. So what I was allegedly doing, I shouldn't say allegedly, what I was supposed to do, because that will make me sound like I was working for the CIA. I was not, just so you know, don't read, if you see it on the internet, it's not true. I would gladly work for the CIA. I have nothing against them, but I just wasn't. It's just not factually true. But I was wrestling with these literature. In fact, I had two books. I'm going to make this more simple. I had two books with me. I had a very famous book by O'Donnell and Schmitter called Transitions from Authoritarian Rule, and that's a theory about transitions to democracy. And I had another book with me by Crane Britton, written in 1932, it's called Anatomy of Revolutions. And this is about the French and the Bolshevik and the Chinese Revolution and kind of the path of revolutions. And every week I would go to different events and I would wonder, is this a transition to democracy or is this a revolution? And I even wrote one of my favorite pieces ever. I wrote in August of 1990. And it used Crane Britton to suggest what might happen in the Soviet Union. And Britton's theory was about different phases of revolution. First, the Entente regime begins to crumble. Then the moderates take over. Then the Jacobins take over. Then the radicals take over. And then there's something that he called Thermidor, right? The counter-revolution, the strongman, Napoleon, Stalin, right, comes in. And I wrote this 1990, right? So even a year before the Soviet Union collapsed. And I went through this. And I said Gorbachev is the moderate, and maybe Yeltsin and the Jacobins might take over. But then we might have Thermidor, where a strong hand would say, we need to restore the old great state that we had, and that turned out to be Putin 2 decades later. The tragedy of my academic career was that was not published in the APSA or any famous academic journal. It was published in the San Jose Mercury News, and nobody's ever read it. But I tell you that story because at that moment, I didn't know which way it was going to go. And as a result, I wrote with a colleague of mine, we did a series of interviews with leaders at the time, capturing the uncertainty of the moment. So we interviewed the liberal Democrats, but we also interviewed the fascists. This is when I met this guy, Zhirinovsky, if you remember him in that period, but I also met the guys that ran Pamyat at the time. And we also interviewed the neo-communists, because we didn't know revolutions, when the old regime collapses, you don't know what comes next. And we did that on purpose. It's in the Hoover archives. All those interviews are there because it was uncertain. When the Democrats won, and they did, in my view, when they took over in 1991, I did think it was a euphoric period, and so much so that I kind of quit my academic career. Wasn't going anywhere, by the way. I was over 23 on the job market that year, so it's not like I had something to preserve. But I went and worked for an American NGO to promote democracy in Russia, the National Democratic Institute. And what I would say is I still believe that bet was right. I still think that there was a chance for democracy to consolidate. I do not think, because of Russian culture or history, that it was inevitable that we get Putin. But we should have had a hedge. We should have had a hedge for the rest of the post-communist world, which would have been NATO membership, and if they couldn't qualify for that, weapons to Ukraine in the 90s, not in 2014 or 2022, to help them in case they got what they got today. Now, with respect to 2009, that's different. So whether or not everybody in the Obama administration would agree with me, I want to be clear, I was not the President of the United States. I was a senior administration official at the White House. I had zero, naivete about Putin. I wrote my first anti-Putin piece in March of 2000, and that you can get. San Jose Mercury News is not online. That's in the Washington Post. It's called Indifferent to Democracy. He'd already started to roll back democracy back in 2000, way before we got there. 2009, the way I understood it, was we were running Reagan's play vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And it's in chapter, I'm pretty sure, it's chapter 27 or 29 of George Shultz's memoirs, one of the greatest secretaries of state our country's ever had.
Ambassador, may I jump in?
Okay, but I want to answer that question. It matters to me.
Please.
Well, just let me finish, because it's important to me, because you can see I'm getting a little defensive even, right? That was not about cooperating with Russia. That was not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. That was about advancing our national security interests. We wanted to get a START treaty. You can't do that without the Russians. We wanted to have our supplies to our soldiers in Afghanistan to not just go through Pakistan, because we wanted to go into Pakistan and kill Osama bin Laden. Can't do that if 95% of your supplies go through there. We wanted to stop the Iranians from having nuclear weapons, and we thought sanctions would help that. Can't get a Security Council resolution without the Russians. And some people say, well, we were naive about the Russians. That was not my view. But we also did what they tried to do in the Reagan era, and that backfired, which is we also had to have we tried a strategy of dual track diplomacy, which was to engage the government and society at the same time. When Ronald Reagan went to the Soviet Union in May of 1988, he met with Gorbachev, and then he had a lunch in the house, Spaso House, the ambassador's house, where human rights activists were invited. We tried to do that too. It worked in the early years of Medvedev, but it backfired when Putin came into power.
Thank you. So
I'll be briefer, I promise, but that was a big, hard question.
So Magda and I thought about playing good cop, bad cop, but then both of us wanted to be bad cops. So in that spirit, I appreciate, Ambassador, when you mentioned that the world is complex and we shouldn't cartoonize it, which brings me to the title of your book, Autocrats versus Democrats. So you have these two teams, but of course global governance itself is not democratic, with the US being the predominant power. And by the way, if you look at the team members on both sides, Russia and China have been cooperating extensively with democracies across the global south, not least South Africa and Brazil. And the United States has very close relations to these days with a number of autocracies in the Middle East. So could it be that the real difference between teams is not about democracy versus autocracy, but rather about supporting a unipolar US-dominated global order versus resisting US dominance in the name of multipolarity?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're not playing bad cops. These are good questions. These are hard questions, and they're the right questions. Most certainly, each one of the major sections of my book begins with 91 and then talks about how we're not in 1991 again. So unipolar world then, we're not there now with respect to power. Everybody wanted to be democratic 1991, we're not there now 30 years later. Liberal international order that we anchored 1991, 92, we're not there now. And I have 3 chapters going through that history, and I agree with that assessment. At the same time, I didn't use the word but on purpose. I do think that autocracies behave differently than democracies in the international system. And I think in terms of the prescriptive chapters, if we are going to compete effectively with the Chinese and the Russians, we need to bring the free world together more closely. And I go back to 1945. I think there's a myth. I use that phrase, liberal international order, but it wasn't an international order. It was actually Bretton Woods, right? When we created the World Bank and the IMF and GATT and later the World Trade Organization, that brought together the free world. It kept out the Soviets. It brought together our team and kept them out. And it was only later when we brought the Chinese in and the Russians in and other non-democracies, and I write about it in my book, I think we were too lax about that. I think we let them in too quickly, and they undermined the rules of the game in those systems, and that led to a backlash, including here in our country, about global trade. So that's the first thing. I think we need to go back to reuniting the liberal or democratic world and bring the club of democracies together precisely the way I think, especially Xi Jinping and the Chinese are doing. We should replicate what they're doing. But the second thing, I'm glad you brought up India and Brazil, because President Trump right now has alienated both of those countries. The meeting he had with Cyril Ramaphosa in the Oval Office was as bad as the meeting he had, his first meeting with Zelensky. I don't think that's strategic on our part. You don't do that. You bring them together. I don't think it's strategic to say, we want to take part of your country, Denmark, because we think that's in our security. That's not the way you treat democratic allies. You don't make jokes about Canada should become the 51st state. I was born near that border, folks. I have lots of Canadian friends. They don't think that's funny. They thought that we were united by these common ideals. And when we begin to do that, I think in the long run, it hurts our long-term interests. And yes, we are still powerful enough that we can coerce a lot of small countries, including democracies. We can do it. We can get away with it. But you know what? When you're coerced, I grew up in Butte, Montana. It's a pretty rough place. This guy, Eddie, he was a really rough guy. He used to beat me up every chance he got. Walking home from 3rd to 5th grade. Every chance he got, he beat me up. He had a lot of coercive power. He was strong. And I had to acquiesce to what Eddie wanted me to do. But did I like it? Did I think we were on the same side? No. And when I got strong enough to not have to be part of Eddie's, criminal operation in Butte, Montana, I bolted from it. And what I worry about, that we use so much coercive and unilateral power right now, that in the long run, our friends are going to start to hedge their bets.
Well, I just want to kind of continue on this question instead of asking you a new one. So therefore, if we believe that if China were a democracy, we would have less conflict. But
I believe that.
You bring up, but then we have India. That's a democracy, and we're having serious tension with them over technology transfer. And the relationship with Russia, right? And oil purchases, we talked about this earlier today. So could you say that perhaps the power competition is separate from ideology or regime type?
It's both. We have to get used to the fact you guys are trying to be one or the other. You're sounding like John Mersheimer right now.
We're going by the title.
It's both. It's power and regimes. If you just focus on regimes, you won't get the dynamic that you just talked about with India. Exactly right. But if you just focus on power, you won't get the interactions that you have between democracies and autocracies. But with India is a really great example. Raise your hand if you're worried about India invading our country. Not a single person here is worried about India invading our country. That, I think, is a testimony to the fact that we're not, if India was an autocracy and a dictatorship and it allied with Russia and China, my guess is more people would raise their hands. So I actually think it's both, and what I worry about in academia and in policy world is that we just focus on one. I sat into 100 meetings in the White House where everybody said it's all just transactional. It's all about power. Vladimir Putin, he's a transactional government. Mike, you don't understand Vladimir Putin. Very senior government officials said this. I'm not going to name them on stage right now. And that turned out to be incorrect. It wasn't just we could do a deal with this guy if we just, traded some power or traded some oil and gas. Actually, he's ideologically motivated. And when we don't acknowledge that, when we don't do the proper diagnostics, we develop what I think are insufficient policies.
Ambassador, let me squeeze in one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And it's right on the topic of conflict. So you seem to want to strike an optimistic note and say that conflict is not inevitable. At the same time, you acknowledge that democracy promotion creates an existential threat for autocracies. So it seems that your prescription for democracy promotion makes conflict inevitable in your own framework. So how do you wrap your head around that?
Yeah, all these are great questions. You guys are lucky to have these professors here at USC, by the way.
We have many more.
So there is an ideological tension there between autocracies and democracies. No matter how many happy talks, no matter how many track 2 dialogues you have, there will be. But I say two things in terms of correcting in the book. Number one, I like to remind people that even during the height of the Cold War, when we had this ideological competition, we still, with the Soviets, cooperated on things that were in our mutual national interests. So we signed arms control treaties during that period. We helped to work together to eradicate smallpox. We led the world to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. And we did that with the, Khrushchev called it peaceful coexistence. It's like, okay, we're going to disagree about regime type and legitimacy, but we're going to cooperate here. That's number one. The second thing that I write about in the book, at this stage in world history, I think we need to have a defensive posture when it comes to democracy, which is not fomenting revolution in Russia or China. We're not doing that, just so we're clear, and we don't have the capacity or the means to do that. So let's not focus on that. Let's focus on shoring up democracies and seizing, when they come, opportunities for breakthrough. So last year, for instance, there was an election in Venezuela, and very clearly falsified. The Democrats, the small d Democrats, won that election. That was a moment like the Orange Revolution in 2004, and we didn't seize it. We didn't put enough pressure. We didn't organize the world to say, it's time, Maduro, you lost the election. That's an example where a breakthrough was there and we didn't seize it. But then I would just say, if you really want to fight for freedom in the world, there are two places where we have to be rock solid in support: Ukrainians and the people that live in Taiwan. And we're not threatening anybody. We're not going in. We are just saying this is an independent country, and we believe that Ukraine should be free, and we should respect their sovereignty and their territorial integrity. I think defense is what we need to do now.
It's an excellent point. Thank you. Are we ready to take questions from the audience?
Hello? Okay. We have a lot of questions. Thank you from everybody. I mean, a tremendous amount of interest in a number of topics. I want to start with our students. We have a number of questions from our students. Ambassador McFaul, you have an incredible career in public service, in international public service, and you're a professor. Many students are asking, what sort of advice would you give our students who remain interested in careers in international public service, diplomacy, international business, but they're actually afraid about taking the steps towards those careers for a number of reasons. One is increased tensions. So it's easier to go be an internationalist when everybody's kumbaya and globalization. And also because of maybe getting tagged in a negative way in their career if they're studying languages and regions and things like that. And what would you say to them?
So that's a great question. I don't have an easy answer. It's a hard question, and I'll think about it harder, and I'll tweet about it tomorrow. So follow me on Twitter. But I'd say a couple things off the top of my head. First, go to a great university. You're already doing that. Second, learn a foreign language. In my career, learning Russian, I started first-year Russian as a 17-year-old kid at Stanford, and it was transformational in terms of living abroad. When I worked in the government, anytime President Obama had a meeting with the Russians, he always brought me. I hope that he thought I was a good advisor about what we should say, but it was mostly because I spoke Russian. And I was on the phone with him whenever he was on the phone with Putin or Medvedev, because he wanted somebody that understood. And there were some moments where the translation broke down that I could come to the aid of the president. And so you want to be in the room where it happens. Learning a foreign language helps. Third, I know it's a hard time to think about government careers because right now the government is slashing and burning all of the jobs. I have many former students that have lost their jobs in the last several months. And my own students at Stanford, they're like thinking this is not a great career move. I would say two things about that. One, play the long game. If you want to be a diplomat, take the Foreign Service exam now, because you're going to fail it 3 or 4 times. It's a really hard test. I did not pass it when I was closer to your age than I am. I failed that test. So it's going to take a while to get in. And then you're going to go to FSI, and you're going to learn a language, a foreign language. The government's going to pay for that, by the way, a really nice benefit of being a diplomat. And then you're going to go for your first several tours of duty, and most certainly your first one, you're going to work in consular services, which is completely nonpartisan. Well, that's actually, it's getting more and more partisan these days, but you're going to be fine for the long run. Don't worry about the short-term politics of our country. And the fourth thing I'll say is we need you. We need the best and the brightest to serve in our government, because without an effective government, we're going to lose this great power competition I'm talking about. And I'll just say anecdotally, I've spent most of my life in academia, right? I was just in government for 5 years, but they were 5 just fantastic years. I loved working at the White House. And just leave your partisan politics aside, just the ability to work for somebody like President Obama that wanted to learn about the outside world and listen to us, and we made mistakes, and I write about them in the book. But I love that experience of being on a team, Team America. By the way, for the academics, I love the fact that there are no footnotes in government. So you get to write a speech and you're not criticized because McFaul said this and McFaul said that. There's too much personalization in academia. I love that experience, and I miss it. I love being on a team as opposed to just being a solo actor as an academic. And I really loved serving as a U.S. ambassador to Russia. If you get the chance to be ambassador, do it, okay? And let me tell you why I loved it so much. Because I love America. I love this country with all of our flaws. And my job in a really difficult place with tens of millions of people was to be the conduit between our politics and our businesses and our governors and our culture and our NBA. Like, you know, the NBA came to my house in Moscow. They haven't been to my house in Palo Alto. I got so much pleasure out of country western groups and jazz groups coming and gospel choirs. One of the most moving events I had in my life was being in a hall 10 times the size of this one with Russians. And a gospel choir, I think from Alabama, came.
We only have time for a few more questions.
Well, this is important to me,
okay.
So I'm going to finish on this. You can, well, I'm going to finish on this. And everybody in the room, nobody spoke English, and they sang at the end, they sang Amazing Grace. And the whole place got up and sang, mostly in Russian. And they were moved by these American kids, excuse me for the college kids. They've never been to Russia before. And that experience of representing your country abroad, fantastic. So join the Foreign Service. And now all my answers will be 7 seconds long, I promise.
All right. There are no... Okay, it should be on. Okay, so a next set of questions is about Russia and how you understand or how you are seeing, because you have very specific experience in Russia, how you understand Russian politics today and over the coming years. In particular, how do you see, if at all, the coalescing of opposition at all happening in Russia? Or what are the factions? Because from outside, people are saying it's one black box and there's Putin.
So if you want short answers, you got to ask easier questions, folks. That's a really hard, big question. And my quick answer is I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't trust anybody who answers that question like they know what's going on, because we don't have good information about society in Russia. Putin's regime is totalitarian. I think it's more authoritarian than the late Gorbachev Soviet period. And so if you're living in Novosibirsk or Vladivostok and Ivan Ivanovich from Moscow calls you polling and says, I work for Levada, a polling firm, tell me what you think about Putin, there's only one rational answer to that question. I support Vladimir Putin. So we don't really know.
But just very quickly, the democratic recession data you showed around the world does seem to suggest quite strongly that the demand for democracy is in some way declining, and one reason could be that democracy has not delivered, right? In terms of governance, corruption, in terms of economic development, and so forth. We don't need to go in depth on that. This is just it. Yeah.
Well, but Russia's not a democracy, so you can't make that argument.
It was in the 90s, and it had a very traumatic experience, which you know very well.
Well, that's right. That's how Putin became popular.
Exactly.
But people are not voting, they're not anti-democratic because they've lived 26 years under dictatorship. I think that's not a fair, I wouldn't read it that way. I'm happy to answer the question, but I also want to get to more questions.
Okay.
I haven't answered the question yet, but if you don't want me to, I won't. It's up to you.
It's up to you, Jerry.
Well, I'll give you one more and you can blend it in. So it's about Europe, at least. So there's several questions about the rise of nationalism around the world and how you understand the what is happening within the EU, particularly as it relates right now to the war and Russian relations, and particularly also U.S.-EU relations, or even you could say U.S.-NATO for that matter.
Well, that's a good segue to what I was about to say. First of all, on the Russia side, I would say to my best guess, and I know all the polling companies well, and I know the Russian opposition well, I think if we had to guess, a solid minority, if not a minority, majority, support Vladimir Putin. And for the reasons that he came in at the right time, in the right place, the economy began to grow, not because of dictatorship. I want to make this clear. That correlation is not causation. It grew because of oil prices, folks. It grew because of oil prices, and he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I think we just need to understand that, and that's why he rose to popularity. But he's got his core followers, and we know who they are. The older you are, the more rural you are, the less education you have and the poorer you are, the more you support Vladimir Putin, you're in his ecosystem. Then, for the young people here, if you're at a university, at a major university in a major city in Russia, you are unlikely to support Putin. And we know this. The younger you are, the more educated you are, the richer you are, the more urban you are, you don't support Putin. And then in the middle, there's what they call the bolota, the swamp. And they're just like, I don't want to listen to politics. By the way, there's probably a lot of Americans that feel that way too, right? I just keep my head down, I don't want to listen to it. I think that's the way I would describe it. Why it got that way is because democracy wasn't delivering in Europe as well, and in the United States as well. And populists blamed, they got off of the axis of economics, right? Left versus right, and they got onto this new axis of identity politics. And my colleague Frank Fukuyama has written a brilliant book about this, and President Trump used that too, where they blamed others, the other, and that is a transnational phenomenon. That's not just an American or European phenomenon.
All right, thank you. The next set of questions will pivot to China. We have a bunch of questions on China. And there's sort of two ways in how these are being asked. One is, how do you understand China really being a threat to countries within the USA sphere of influence, particularly in the Western world? Is that really happening, or how does it happen? And the flip side to that is China really of any threat to US interests in Asia? Because you could see there's maybe some rhetoric, there are some economic moves, there's Belt and Road, but it doesn't seem like an overt actions. How would you understand?
Again, great questions. It's hard to answer in 20-second sound bites, but I'll try. So one of the motivations for writing this book was to actually interrogate the hypothesis that kind of became conventional wisdom in the United States, that China is seeking to take over the world and export communism. That about 2017, 2018, that became a very popular idea, and it's still popular today in foreign policy elite circles. And I wanted to look at the data. That's what academics do, and I spent a lot of time over the last several years learning about China, living there, teaching there. And I didn't see data to support the hypothesis that they want to make the whole world communist. And I could be wrong, I could be naive, I'm not a China specialist, and I'm told that by people that really understand Xi Jinping because they've read all of his collected works, but I know they haven't been hanging out with Xi Jinping, so I think that data is somewhat mixed on that. I think one can have multiple objectives at the same time in terms, like Belt and Road Initiative, you can have economic interests and also this competition with the United States at the same time. Second, I am worried about economic competition with China, in part because they use the state and subsidies to gain an advantage over us, and in part, see, the world is complex, it's not one or the other, and in part because they have a very competitive ecosystem between their different regions in China that push to zero profits for things like solar power and EVs, and both of those two things combined are extremely challenging for our companies to compete with. But that's different than taking over the world. What I worry the most about, and I write about it in detail in the book, is war over Taiwan. I worry the most, whether through consciously or we stumble into it, but that to me is a flashpoint, and I want to do everything I can to prevent that war. And that includes both preventive deterrence things that I think the United States and our allies should be doing in Asia, with Taiwan and around the island, and also proactive things to say we will not recognize the independence of Taiwan. That's my view. Other members of Congress, other senators, maybe some senators from here, I don't know where Lindsey Graham is on this these days, but I think that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake. I think strategic ambiguity has served us well, and I want to preserve it because I do not want to have a war over Taiwan. I think it would be bad for Taiwan, bad for China, and bad for the United States.
Okay, with another set of questions, and I should note that we only have a few minutes left. It goes back to one of the grand motivations for this book and this talk, and it's about the situation in Ukraine. It's sort of the so what question. Could you go back to this? There's a lot of questions about this in the sense of, well, what happens if we just sort of weakly back, or we really don't back the Ukraine, and Russia gains an advantage there in some significant way? What's next? And because there's other questions, is there, we're looking at the drones going into Europe, the drones going into Polish airspace. Do you also feel that there's a potential, in the next 12 months for another provocation against NATO countries, the Baltic states?
And by the way, it's not too late to enter the competition for the Nobel Peace Prize.
And I do want to add to this, that let's not forget that Putin has placed nuclear-capable weapons in Belarus. So in this context.
So are we at the end? So forgive me, but because you're asking big, hard questions, and I want to give you really genuine answers, okay? I want to answer your question in two radically different ways. And one, I'm going to make it personal, and then the other, I'm going to talk about it strategically. So on the day that Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I was texting with one of my close Ukrainian friends. We run a program for leadership in Ukraine. We've had lots of Ukrainians over the last 2 decades at Stanford. We've hosted President Zelensky. You saw him. One of our former leaders won the Nobel Peace Prize 3 years ago, Lysa Matvichuk. So I have a lot of personal connections with Ukrainians. And this woman, her name's, I don't think she would mind me telling you, her name's Svetlana Zalashuk. And I want to make it personal, because sometimes we talk about these things in abstract. This war is not abstract for me. Svetlana was driving out of the city with her baby, worried that she might not get out of town in time before the Russians would come and kill her. She was a member of parliament. She's close to Zelensky. That's what is her worry. And by the way, we now know that people like Svetlana had real reason to worry that these Russians, she was on a list, and she was on a hit list to be killed if they took over Kyiv. And she was driving out, and she said, Mike, we're going to fight these guys. We're going to prevail. I just can't believe we have to fight this bastard alone. That's what she said to me in a text, September 24th, 2022. And for me personally, ever since that day, I vowed that I'm going to be in this fight with Svetlana and all my Ukrainian friends for as long as it takes, and get up every single day and think about what more I can do, because Svetlana is on the side of good, Putin's on the side of evil. That's my view. Svetlana lives in a democracy. It matters to me. Putin is a dictator. Putin is an imperial person who is annexing territory. Folks, we fought a war. 1939, go back, look at the history of World War II. We fought a war to stop people like Stalin and Hitler. He is in that category. I don't want to be on his side. I want to be on the other side. So I actually think that there is right and wrong in the world. And a lot of Americans say Americans don't care about that. I disagree. I give a lot of talks about these kind of things. I actually think Americans care about morality. We are not cynical geopolitical people. I want to be on the side of Democrats and against autocrats, personally. That's on a personal level. But say you don't care about that. You just care about America and, you know, what's happening in your local community. I get it. Here's why you should also care. Because we did this, folks. We did this in the 1930s. Italy went into Ethiopia. Nobody knew where Ethiopia was. Japanese, gradually, and then dramatically, they went into China, and we all said, that's not our problem. We're not going to get involved in that. That's not our problem. And then Stalin and Hitler went into Poland, and then Stalin went into a bunch of other places, and Hitler went into a bunch of other places, and millions of Americans still said, not our problem. We had this American First Committee. America First, if you heard that phrase before, go and read the history of the 1930s. Millions and millions of Americans, up until December 7th, 1941, that's what they said. We don't have a dog in this fight. And we tragically learned how that theory of world politics didn't work. And I think we're in a similar moment. If we do not help the Ukrainians stop Putin in Ukraine today, we might be fighting them in Lithuania tomorrow. And you know who believes that? The Lithuanians. The former foreign minister of Lithuania, he's at my institute right now, that's what he worries about. So let's stop them in Ukraine so we don't have to fight them as part of the NATO alliance if we're called upon. But same with Taiwan. I was just in Taiwan 3 months ago. You know, the group of people in the world cheering the loudest for the Ukrainians, I saw lots of Ukrainian flags in Taiwan. It's the Taiwanese, because they understand if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, that's going to encourage Xi Jinping, and that could get us into a war on Taiwan. And then finally, in the fight between autocrats versus Democrats, and this gets us back to South Africa and India, which are really important, you know, the swing states. I have a whole section about the swing states and the middle states. And if you're watching this great power competition, and America looks like we're pulling back, we're weak, we're fighting among ourselves so we're not engaged in the world, then you're just going to hedge your bets a little bit. And you're going to lean just a little bit more towards the Chinese and the Russians. Conversely, if the Ukrainians prevail and we help them prevail, I think the rest of the world is going to lean a little bit more towards us. So I think there are real moral reasons why we want to be on the side of the good Ukrainians versus the evil dictatorship that's attacked their country, but I also think it's in America's national interest.
Thank you so much.
We had many good questions that we were not able to get to this evening, but I will say, having worked through them with Jerry, a lot of them are answered in the book, which is on sale in the lobby.
You got to come on the road with me. That was perfect.
You can't get this on Amazon, and better than that, I asked ChatGPT this morning, it doesn't know what's in it. So you could be faster than AI. But let me thank again Dean Verma, Jerry McDermott, my colleagues in the McCausland College of Arts and Sciences, all of our VIP guests, all of you who are here, and most importantly, thank you, Ambassador McFaul, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody would like to purchase Ambassador McFaul's book, they are available in the lobby.
Thank you all. Thanks.